You ever been a developer playing Minecraft and you're just wondering how this toolbar here at the bottom works? How we're able to swap between weapons, how if we scroll up it's not going to go out of range, if we scroll back it's not going to go out of range. If we have this selected item, it's just going to work. Mine it really quickly. If we have a different item in hand, it's going to mine it slowly. Well, if that's the case, then look no forward. Let's get into it. Alright, let's go ahead and get into it. For this tutorial, I went ahead and imported a couple of assets, being a pickaxe sprite, an axe sprite, and then I also imported two other sprites, being the full hotbar and then the selected item within the hotbar. And these two pixel art sprites I created using an app called Pixart, and I'll put a link to that down in the description. I just made a 16 by 16 sprite and imported it into here. And once I imported it, I went up here to texture type, changed it to 2D, sprite 2D and UI, and went down here and changed the filter mode to point. If you don't do that, the image is going to be very blurry. And that's all I did for these two sprites. And then for the hotbar and the selected item in the hotbar was a little more difficult. I went into a free software called GIMP and separated these two and made sure that their backgrounds were transparent. And then same thing for importing them here. I went sprite 2D and UI, and actually came here in the sprite editor and moved these little green points all to surround the box. And then I did the same thing here for the selected item, just move that so it's surrounding the specific part. Alright, so for the first part of this tutorial, and also this is coming after the block mining video, so if you haven't checked that one out, I will leave a link to that video as well, and you can go ahead and check out that video. This is following up on that one. So the first thing we're going to be doing here is actually go ahead and create a UI. And we'll go down here, UI canvas, we'll just call this UI. Then next we're going to go back down to UI, select image, and this is going to be the image that's holding the hotbar, so we'll just rename it to hotbar. And then for my case, since I already have this toolbar transparent and already ready, I can go ahead and drag and drop here, and you can see on the game view that it looks a little weird. We need to go to image type and change that to simple. And we can also see that it's a little stretched out, so we can go ahead and move that very quickly. So we'll come out here in the scene view and just move it down to the bottom of the screen. And then also you'll know that at this point, if we stretch this, it does stay with it. We're going to come up here to the rect transform and change the anchor preset. We're going to change it to this bottom one so that it's anchored to the bottom of the UI at all times. And then the next thing we need to do is scale this correctly. And I think that looks about right. And it can change depending on whatever size you want it to be. And that's all we need to do to set up the hotbar. The next thing we need to do is actually create the item slots. And so we'll go down here, go to UI panel, and we'll set this as a child to the hotbar. And you can see it takes up this whole field. And what we're going to do first is go ahead and go to the background. So here in the source image, go to background. We'll change it to none. And then the next thing to do, which I don't think is the most correct way to do this, but we're going to be scaling this panel down to fit the size of that little inventory slot. And that looks pretty perfect. You can see it here on the game view. It's filling up the majority of that item slot. And the next thing we'll do is actually change the alpha of this image to 0 so we can't see any color show up. And so once we have this first panel, and we'll actually rename it to item slot, we can go ahead and duplicate this. So just press Ctrl D and simply move it to each of the item slots. We'll duplicate this Alright, so now we have a panel for each of these item slots, and whenever we actually get into the code, we'll be manipulating the source image, and we will throw in the sprites corresponding to whichever item is in that slot. And then lastly, to finish out just the visual aspect, we are going to need to add the selected item. And the way I did it, since this, you can see the sprite is off-centered, I'm sure if I was a little bit better, I'd have this fully centered so I wouldn't have to do this next step. But we're going to go ahead and create an empty game object. We'll call this selected item. And then a child of this newly created empty game object, we will create a UI image. We'll just call this selected. We'll go in here and put our selected sprite in here. And we can see it's freaking out here on the scene view. Again, we're just going to go to that simple. And then in here, actually we're going to unparent this really quickly so that whenever we move this selected item game object, it's also going to move this selected object. So the first thing we need to do is select this selected item empty game object, move it to the center of the selected item, and then go ahead and reparent. So now when we move this, it's going to line up perfectly. As you can see on the game view down here, it's lined up perfectly. And so this is everything we're going to need to do for the visuals. And essentially what's going to be happening is that whenever we use the scroll wheel, we are going to be manipulating the position of this game object. And it's just going to be the position of these item slots. And it will move accordingly whenever we use the scroll wheel. Then next we're going to go ahead and create the two scripts we're going to need for this. It's going to be the inventory let this load real quick. And then the next script we're going to need is the inventory slot. And now that those two have been created, we will go ahead and jump into the next section. Alright, back here. First thing we're going to need to do is actually change the starter asset input. And so back here, this is similar to what we did last time in the block mining video, but we're going to be adding another action, and we'll just call this inventory change. Okay, we've got it called inventory change. We're going to set the action type to a value and set the control type to a vector2. So this is how getting the scroll wheel working with the new input system is going to work. So we're going to have a value is going to return a vector2. It's either going to be positive 120 or 240 or negative 120 or negative 240. And depending on that value, it's going to be able to tell whether you're scrolling the mouse wheel up or down. Here in the binding, we can go ahead and go to the path, go to mouse, and then we'll go to scroll. And then using control scheme, we'll go ahead and click keyboard and mouse. Go ahead and save that asset. And then we will go ahead and jump into the first script. Alright, we're here in the inventory script, and let's go ahead and block it out really quickly, and then we'll get into what each of the functions are actually doing, or actually each of the methods are actually doing. Alright, so here we have the fully laid out script. Let's go ahead and go over it. So at the very top we have the serialized field for the private inventory slot. This will likely be changed later if we decide to go further, but this is just so that we can add items to the inventory, and we will fully flesh out this inventory slot script here in a second. And since the Minecraft version has 9 slots, we're going to go ahead and do the same thing here. It's going to be an array of 9 slots. That size isn't going to change at all. Next we have another serialized field for the selected object. This is going to be that little yellowish square that's going to follow which item is being selected. Next we have the inventory index, and this is going to keep track of which item slot we are currently selecting. Then we have the private rect transform. This is just so we have a reference to the position of that selected game object. And here we're going to be subscribing to the starter assets event. We'll add that here in a second. We'll have to go back to one of the previous scripts. And so this will just be firing whenever we scroll a mouse wheel. And so on scroll, we're going to be listening with the update selected item. And this event is going to pass in a vector 2, and that's going to be that scroll vector. So it's either going to read positive 120 or negative 120. Or sorry, yes. And then next, we're going to go ahead and assign this reference here. And this is going to be get component of the rect transform of the selected slot. And then here, we're actually changing the position of that object. And in order to do this, we're actually having to change the rect transform and not the global position, since this is a UI element. So this will line it up perfectly on top of those panels that we had created for each of the inventory slots. Here on disable, we're just unsubscribing so there aren't any errors. And then here we have the update selected item, and we're passing in that vector 2 from the event. This is going to pass in a vector 2, and whichever method is listening to it has to have that same parameter. And this is just going to be determining which way we're scrolling. And so we're basically saying if the scroll, and also the value that's changing is the y value of this vector. We're saying if it's greater than 0, so if we're scrolling the mouse wheel up, then we're going to check to see if the inventory index is 0. And if it is 0, then we're going to throw it back to the end. So we go back here. So if the inventory is here at 0 and we scroll up, we want it to move to the very back. And that's what that line is doing here. And then if it's not, if it's anywhere but 0, we're just going to decrease it. And so if it's here at the 4th slot and it's not at 0, we're just going to move it to the 3rd slot. Okay, and then we're doing else if. This is the other end of it. So if we're scrolling down, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to check to see if it's at the very end. And this is just getting the very last slot in that array. So we're basically saying if the slot is here and we scroll down, it's going to move back to the start. And then the reverse is true here. If it's anywhere else, we're just going to increase it by 1. Then here at the very bottom, this is where we're actually changing the position. And here at the start, we're just changing the position to the very first slot in that inventory. Down here, we're going to be changing it to whichever position, whichever index the inventory is at. So if it's at the 3rd index, it's going to get that position and that rect transform of that 3rd slot and change it. So that selected local position, that selected item is going to change to that 3rd slot. Then finally, we have a item, so we have a method that's returning an item. And this is just going to go into the inventory. It's going to get the inventory's current index and then return that specific item. And since we don't have the inventory slot script worked out yet, is why there's an error here. And also we haven't added the events in the other script. That's why there's an error here. Let's go ahead and work on those. All right, we're here in the inventory slot script. Let's go ahead and flesh it out and then we'll explain it. Alright, here's the full thing for the inventory slot, and this is going to go on each one of those panels that's in the inventory. And so at the very top, we're going to have the actual item scriptable object that this inventory slot is holding. Another thing, we need to be using the Unity engine.ui so we can get these image properties. And here in the start method, we're basically saying if there is no item in this inventory slot, then we're not going to be doing anything. And so that will prevent any null reference exceptions. We're saying here if the item sprite, and so we'll be adding this to the item scriptable object script. And we're basically saying if the item sprite is null, we're going to go ahead and do nothing. And this will be changing based on if we continue and actually change the inventory system so that you can pick up items and it's not just set in the inspector at the beginning. Here we're getting a reference to the image component on this game object, and we're changing the sprite for that image to the item scriptable object's actual item sprite. And then these three lines here at the bottom, in Unity, for some reason, if you add a sprite to it, the alpha transparency is really low, and this is changing that. And you can't directly change the image color value here since it's a field. So we have to go around. We're just creating a temporary variable, setting it to the item image.color. So this is just the image component getting the color, and then we're changing the alpha transparency to 1 for this variable, and then setting that color value back to this variable here. And so all this is doing is just setting it so that the pixel art sprite that's in that item slot will be fully, it'll be 1 on the alpha, so it'll be fully visible. And that's all we need to do for this. We can actually go ahead and go into the item scriptable object and go ahead and add a serialized field for a, say it's going to be a public, sprite. We'll call this item sprite. And so now whenever these scriptable objects are being created, they will have these sprite components depending on what the item is. If we actually go back to inventory slot, those errors are now gone. And then the next thing we need to do is actually go back and change the first person controller. So let's do that here in a second. Alright, so I lied. The first thing we need to do is actually change the starter asset inputs. And what we're going to be doing here is we need to be using the system here. We're going to be creating a public static event action, and this is going to be called onScroll. So this is that event we were talking about earlier, and it's not going to take in any parameters or any data types. It's just going to be a normal event. And then the next thing we need to do, so when we change that input asset here, if we go back, when we added this inventory change, we need to add the method that's going to respond to this. So if we actually go back here, go down here, go to public void and do on inventory change, and it's going to take the input value, and then we're going to be invoking this event up here. So we'll do onScroll invoke, and then it needs a vector2. I actually just remembered that. This is going to be a vector2, so it's knowing what direction we're scrolling in. In order to get the vector2 from this, we're going to do value dot get, and then we're going to do vector2. There we go. So this event will be fired every time. Hold on. There we go. Just a little error. So now we have this vector2 from this value, so it's either going to be positive 120 or negative 120, and it's going to be sending that vector. And then if we go back to the inventory, those errors are now gone. So now we're going to be receiving that positive 120 or negative 120, and just reading it here depending on what we're going to be doing. And then lastly, we're going to have to go to the first person controller and change that up. Alright, here in the first person controller, I'll go ahead and do this with you guys. We're going to go ahead and delete this serialized field. This was used to determine which item the player was currently holding, but since we now have this inventory, we're going to change this to a private inventory, and we'll just call this inventory. And then down here, it's going to yell at us. So now we will need to update this here in a second. So it's asking for the item scriptable object, and we're going to be doing inventory.get current item. There we go. And so this is going back to that inventory script, and it's just going to be returning the scriptable object in that inventory slot. So here, it's the same thing. This method here in the block script is still asking for that item scriptable object, and now we're just getting it with this method here, now that we have the inventory. So now we'll be able to go in between each inventory slot and get the respective item. And I believe that should be it. If we actually go back to Unity and check to see if it has any errors, it currently doesn't. So let's go ahead and try to run it and see what's going to happen. So we do have an error. Let's go ahead and change that really quickly. Oh yes, so we do need to assign things in the actual inspector here. Oh yeah, so all of these, so since we're doing this by assigning it in the inspector, we need to go ahead and drag and drop all of these into their respective slots. So we go ahead and scroll down here, and I'll go ahead and do that really quickly. And I just remembered, so each of these panels for the inventory slot are going to need that inventory slot script. Now that all of those have been assigned, we can go back to the player. And then, so now that all of these slots have that inventory slot script, now we can add them directly in the inspector. I'll go ahead and do that. And lastly, here we have that selected slot. And then down here we have that game object that's selected slot. We can go ahead and drag and drop directly into there. And then I believe that should be everything. There might be another thing I haven't assigned yet, but all of these panels now have that inventory slot, and none of them have items, but we do have a check for that in the inventory slot script. So this should be error-free now. And there we go. So here we have the inventory at the bottom. If we scroll down, it's going to move it forward one. If we move it up, we scroll up, it's going to move it back. And then since I do have the ability to unlock my scroll wheel, that's pretty satisfying. And it just works. Here we go. Okay, and then we do have an error since we don't have any items currently in there. And that's fine for now. So let's go ahead and change that really quickly. Okay, so we can go ahead and add some of the items that we have created. So here we have the diamond axe, and just to not have a sprite yet, I'm just going to go ahead and assign that here. So we added that sprite right there, and so that's going to appear here in the hotbar. And then also for the diamond pickaxe, it already has the correct sprite for it. So here if we go into the item slot and we add a diamond pickaxe, and then in the second one we add a diamond axe, and we go ahead and run the game, we can see here at the bottom those two sprites are now showing up in the respective inventory slots. And then if we use the item, and let me go ahead and figure out that error really quick. Alright, I found out the error. It's just that here in the inventory script, we need to make sure that we are actually here in the first person controller on start, since this is where the inventory component is going to be held. We need to do inventory and actually assign this reference to the inventory. There we go. So now that we have that reference, and it was throwing an error here because this was not assigned, that's why it had a null reference exception. But now that we've assigned that, we can go ahead and go back to the game. So we've got our diamond pickaxe and our diamond axe. If we go ahead and mine with the pickaxe, doesn't take too long. And if we mine with the axe on this wood block, again, doesn't take too long. And the reason that this is throwing an error here is because we don't have a check here in the mining script to determine if the item doesn't have a mining speed. That's why here it's basically saying this current item is null. So let's go ahead and fix that real quick. Alright, in order to fix that error with our current implementation, we are going to have to create a new item scriptable object. This right now is just an empty item scriptable object. It doesn't have any sprite. The mining speed set to the default 1. And right now we could add an enum for none just to make sure, but since the mining speed of this is 1 already, it's not going to change or speed up anything. And so in any of these inventory slots that don't have an item, we just add this empty scriptable object. Alright, now that all of those have been assigned, we can go back to the game. And if we try to use one of these empty slots on the stone, it's going to take a really long time to mine. And then if we use the axe on the wood block, it goes away very quickly. So that's the fully completed tutorial here. We can now have this toolbar that does not go out of range when we scroll up and down. And it's also updating the position of that selected item. We can now add items to the inventory slots, and each of those will determine how fast we are mining specific objects. And since that's always going to be 2 seconds, since the pickaxe is not proficient against grass. And that's the whole thing. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them down below. I'd love to hear from you. I'm sure there's a lot of things I could have improved on this. That's why I'm here. And I hope you guys enjoyed.